All right. I am here with Rufus Griscom, and he is the co founder and CEO at Next Big Idea Club. How's it going, Rufus?
It's going great. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm excited to unpack this sort of blockbuster exit here, a big headline. I really like talking about big deals like this. But before we get there, let's talk about how you got started and your background and getting into entrepreneurship.
I was torn always between the world of entrepreneurship and kind of a more like literary academic direction. And I actually got my start in my early years. I mean, I was a ski bum. I was a ski instructor. I was a roofer. Had a lots of fun, boring jobs. But I was a young book editor in my early mid 20s, and then very quickly realized that I had to either develop an affection for humorous cookbooks or find another profession. So I launched in 1997, early internet days. I launched a zine about sex and culture called Nerve. The tagline was "Literate Smut." My mother was appalled, and that was my first startup. And I basically built two different startups before the third one, which actually resulted in the exit that I think is our topic today.
Nice. So the transition from Nerve to Babble, how was that? What was that like? Did you have a team when you were doing the zine, and how did that sort of spark take place?
Yeah, I ended up spinning off a series of companies out of my first company. So the first company, Nerve.com, was, grew to, maybe I want to say 25, 30 employees. We spun out of that business, an online dating technology business in 2000. We sold that, but it wasn't a great outcome. Then in 2007, we spun out of Nerve.com, Babble.com, which I really created with my wife, and so it was initially the same ownership structure. But part of this was that a lot of my friends had invested in my original business, and I really wanted to make them money and really wanted to do right by my original investors. But also, the pre-existing business helped to capitalize the launch of this new business. So Babel started as a website and a community for parents. My wife and I were exactly where you are, Steve. I gather you've got like a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. Is that right? Or
One in five. Yep.
1 and 5. Okay, yeah. So we were right there. We just had a kid, and we were like, "Whoa, this whole parenting thing is not what we thought it was. This is actually not just a Hallmark, everybody's smiling, holiday card. This is this is really hard work. We had no idea what we were getting into, kind of thing. But it's magical and amazing. So our feeling was there was not enough honesty and not enough resources in 2007 for young parents, and so we wanted to create a new kind of more honest community and learning platform for parents. We launched that in 2007, and it evolved into what we discovered was mom bloggers, which the whole mom blogging phenomenon was just starting then, were telling the truth about parenting in a way that others weren't. And so this evolved into a platform for mom bloggers, really. We learned how to help mom bloggers grow their audiences, build our website, Babble.com. And we, grew it to about a 10 million a year revenue run rate at the time it was acquired. And it was a great adventure. And I will say that we had decided, having already built two startups, neither of which resulted in great exits, that we were going to be intentionally very financially prudent about how we scaled this business. Because I was a broke, 30 something, and and I wanted to build a great product, but I also wanted to deliver value for investors and deliver value for our team and for us, frankly.
Yeah.
So
That makes sense. So the metrics that you were tracking, like you mentioned 10 million run rate, what were some of the metrics that went into it while you guys were growing? Really, I've heard of Babel. I know a lot of people listening to this have probably heard of it. What were the metrics that you were tracking in the early days? Were they the same by the time of the exit?
It's a great question because, you manage what you measure. The metrics are so important. Figuring out what metrics to track. Ours was the big headline metrics, of course, were unique users, and this was a time when, at the time, we had, grew to 1 million, 5 million, eventually 10 million uniques a month. This was before like BuzzFeed and when Facebook started, people started having 50, 100 million uniques. That wasn't happening back in 2007. But we grew to eventually become, the largest parenting site at the time, which I think was important for the exit. So we were certainly focused on uniques, time on site, engagement, visits per month, all those engagement metrics. And we also were pretty interested in demos. Initially, we had this sort of lofty aspiration to appeal to both moms and dads. We wanted to be more forward thinking. Dads, as you know, are actively engaged in the process of being parents. What we discovered was the advertisers, we were an advertising driven business, really only wanted the moms. They really saw the fathers as irrelevant to purchasing decisions, which perhaps we were. So that because we had made a decision that we were going to really systematically build value, we were, we evolved to be more focused on the mom audience.
Yeah, and that is easily one of, if not the most powerful audience on the internet, regardless of if it was then, now, that mommies really control a lot of buying power online, and Instagram just ignited that in a whole new way over the last 10 years, which has been fun to watch for sure. Well, I'm curious how the conversations began. So when you guys were growing, you hit that 10 number. Was that when you started thinking about the exit? Was it from day one? When did those conversations begin that you were ready to sell?
Yeah, so I took an approach to the process that I have later recommended to friends building businesses I might have learned partly from some of the failures of my previous businesses, which I think were culturally successful and by many metrics, but weren't great exit outcomes. And what I did was I identified pretty early on the like 5 most likely acquirers, the best possible acquirers, and sought out and identified the stakeholders inside those companies who would drive an acquisition decision. And usually you'd start with the head of corp dev. And most of these companies had websites with which we competed. They were our competition, right? Effectively, but owned by big media companies, typically. Amazon. We also talked to Amazon at the time, which obviously was had a great interest in engaging with moms. And I would sit down with them and I would be extremely forthcoming and honest and say, these are our strengths, these are our weaknesses, this is what we're trying to do, this is what's working, this is what's not. Today we're here. In 6 months, this is where we want to be. And then 6 months later, I'd meet them for lunch or coffee or in their office and say, hey, remember we met 6 months ago and I told you we'd be here? Well, now we're here. And in 6 months, here's where we intend to be. And eventually I was able to say, we're going to be bigger than you are. Our website is going to be attracting more moms and more advertisers or what have you than yours 6 months from now at the pace we're going. And what I found was that building those relationships and building those trusts, that kind of trust, I think one of the big challenges in an acquisition situation is that you really need, it's a huge leap of faith, obviously, for the acquirer, right? I mean, they have to trust the CEO, they have to trust the team, they have to want to work with you for years. And it's very difficult to build that kind of trust in a few months. Mm-hmm. And so this ended up working really well because we had several acquirers that eventually were engaged in, a process. And I sort of concluded that building that trust over, 18, 24 months was really important.
Yeah. Love that. So you kind of set the watermark, hit it, came back to them and said, hey, this is the clip that we're growing, set another watermark, hit it. And then it just leaves their creative thought to realizing like, okay, they could actually get bigger than we are. And I love that. Painting a picture for them is great. That's fantastic. So when it came to the valuation, how did you approach it with your best foot forward? How did you kind of back into a number?
So by the way, I'll add one other detail too, which is that I think often the right stakeholder inside of the acquiring company is usually you start with the head of corp dev, but it's often somebody who runs a P&L who you'll eventually report to if they acquire the business. And finding the right stakeholder, building the right relationship with them, and making sure that they have the currency inside the business to actually get an acquisition done. I'd learned the hard way that very often you can have like appetite from one part of the company, but if you don't have the person running the P&L, driven to get this deal done, it won't happen. So that was critical, and that's why we ended up selling to Disney. It was that we had the right person, driving that process. In terms of valuation, we had engaged a bank to help us with the process. And it was Evercore, great boutique investment bank. And they actually said to me, Rufus, at this stage, our advice is that we don't represent you actively, that you represent yourself. And we're just going to be advisors whispering in your ear, because bankers can often mess up the relationship. They can mess up that trust dynamic. And so we think you should drive the negotiation and the process, but we're going to basically be your advisors. And I'll never forget, we of course backed into it with sort of, we were just hitting like a 10 million a year revenue run rate. So we were looking at kind of multiples on revenue, and, sharing what we thought were, the right, comps in the marketplace and why we thought it should be 5x or 6x, and they thought it should be 2x or 3x. And there was I'll never forget this, this conference call I had with the head of corp dev at Disney, who's there on speakerphone, and he's got like his 5 lieutenants around him. And I'm, and he's called, this call is set up to make us the offer. We've been through all this diligence or dancing around what the number was going to be. And he said, like, Rufus, I want you to know that, here at Disney, the way we do things is we do a lot of research, we figure it out, we come up with a number, and that's going to be the number. Like, we don't, once we give you a number like that, that's what the number is going to be, And I'm sitting and I've got my feet up on the desk, partly because I'm trying to be relaxed. Of course, this is a very intense experience, but I'm trying to convince myself that I'm relaxed. And I said, this is Kevin Mayer, who's this legendary, head of corp dev at Disney, and I said, Kevin, are you saying, I said, I just want to get this straight. Are you saying that if you give me a number that's going to be the acquisition number, and I take it back to my board, and my board says, no, we're not willing to sell the company at that number, but we would at this slightly higher number. Are you saying you don't want me to come back to you with another number? And there was like 5 seconds of silence. This is like before video was common. It was just like, and I could tell he was clearly embarrassed, a little bit, or he didn't know how to respond. He was like, "Oh, I guess we'd want to know the number." So they made us an offer. They gave us a number, and we ended up getting about 25% more than that number. And I think if you look up Disney acquisition of Babble, there's a lot of press coverage, and and it was reported to be a $40 million acquisition, and that's about right. There was more nuance to it, but that was about the right zone. So it it was it was a rather intense process, and we wanted more. They wanted to pay less, but we found a spot in the middle.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you kind of realized that he was trying to play hardball and then describing the actual process of going to your board and then going back, just being honest about it, kind of really brought good leverage into the conversation. That's really cool. So with the 25% that you negotiated, how long was the back and forth there? Like, how long did you guys go back and forth around the number? Was it 6 months? How long?
Oh, I would say that whole process, I want to say, took about a week, maybe 10 days. Something that was common at the time, I'm guessing was still common, is that, of course, the acquirer always wants to give you an earnout.
Yeah.
Right. And the earnout is a kind of tricky structure, right? Because it can often the alignment between the entrepreneur or the CEO or the leadership team and the investors parts paths once the company's acquired and there's an earnout, and the acquirer has an incentive to not pay the earnout, but then give people bonuses internally. And, it creates a lot of kind of, I think, unhealthy tensions. Mm-hmm. So we took the approach of saying, listen, we want all the value to be in the acquisition price. We understand that you want to retain us, you want to retain the leadership team, and that's something you should do. I mean, by all means, offer us bonuses or whatever, but we don't want to see, some meaningful percentage of the number in an earnout. And we kind of held fast to that position. Mm-hmm. And I think that was part of what got us to the number that we were hoping to hit. And of course, you always end up with a bonus structure with any deal where they actually want to retain the leadership. Mm-hmm. I think so.
Yeah. And number one question is timing. Why was it the right time? Was it that it was the 10 million run rate number and you guys were growing fast enough? Why was it the right timing for you?
I think a year after we sold the business, I thought, we should have held out another year, because we sold in late 2011, 2012, 2013, all the Facebook referral traffic was just, BuzzFeed was exploding. All these businesses were exploding. We sort of thought we could have gone from 10 to 50 million uniques or something crazy. But a couple years later, the whole online content space kind of imploded. Because this was the third company that I built with wonderful teams of people, and the first two hadn't played out the way that I'd hoped, I was much more sober-minded about kind of what was achievable and what the right horizon was. And the advice that I'd gotten and the calculation that I'd made was, okay, yes, I believed we could absolutely grow the business from 10 million in revenue to 30, 40, 50 million in revenue. But obviously, number one, there's always a risk profile. The future is always uncertain. Number two, you have multiple compression, right? We were able to get, roughly 4x revenue as a smaller company, but as a larger company, we probably wouldn't be able to get that. Mm-hmm. And then additionally, there's always the possibility that you have to do additional rounds of financing and you face dilution. And then you have the time value of money. If you sell the business and you make some money and you put it in the stock market or buy some real estate, your money has value and is worth more in the future. Mm-hmm. So for all those reasons, I concluded that, I should say we concluded, my wife and I and the senior team concluded that it was the right time. And I think in retrospect, it was the right choice.
Yeah. Well said. The time value of money, for sure. And the sober mind from the previous ventures. It's so interesting how people look at things that didn't work out. In reality, those ingredients led to having this work out, right? So it's a fun thought exercise of the importance of just attempting and doing things and just going for it with those previous ventures, getting to the big exit, which takes me to my next question of preparedness. What can you share for somebody listening that's operating? How can they prepare for something like this?
I think first and foremost, it's critical to, to love what you're doing, to obviously build a great company. And you can really only, I think, sell a company if it's a company that you don't want to sell, right? I mean, I think every buyer can always smell. I mean, like if you're buying a used car or something, if somebody wants to sell the car, your alarm bells are going off. like the companies that people want to buy are the companies that the leadership team doesn't want to sell because they believe in it, because it's growing. And I think you have to grow your company with an eye towards continuing to grow it. We were in a process of simultaneously looking at raising a bigger venture capital round as we were going through the exit process. And that was important because, of course, the buyers would say, Rufus, why do you want to sell this business? It's growing at, it's doubling in size every year and X, Y, and Z. And to which I could credibly say, I don't want to sell this business. Actually, I'm not convinced I should sell it. And that's why I'm in parallel in conversations with, several VCs about raising $20 million. And I think I think that's the right way to answer that question. Like if you give off vibes that you're just eager to sell your business, then, I mean, if it's an acqui-hire, if it's sort of if you're looking for a really great outcome, it has to be a business that you actually don't want to sell. So I would say build that business, hire amazing people, don't be too proud about your role. And because the team is always a huge part of the value proposition, right, for the acquirer.
Yeah. Yeah. And how big was the team, and did everybody move over to Disney?
The team was like 40 some people at the time, I want to say 30, maybe high 30s. And most everyone transitioned. Yeah. Yeah.
Nice. So mistakes, what's a mistake that you can highlight that you learned that you could share with somebody that maybe they could avoid going through this?
Well, a big mistake that I used to make was that I found myself, trying to, as a kind of taking on the role as sort of evangelist and booster of the business, that I would be, wanting to, as a young entrepreneur, CEO, I was always wanting to convince everyone that, like, this business is amazing and we're so lucky to be here, and look at where we're going, and isn't it great? And I'd find myself doing that in board meetings, right? And I'd find that the members of the board would say, like, well, what about this, Rufus? Like, this doesn't look very good, and and then I would feel sort of dejected. And then I realized, like, you know what? The better thing to do is to obviously you want to articulate the mission and why you're passionate about it, but is to, be extremely honest about all the problems, all the challenges. And I decided that with our board, I was going to take a tone that was a little more pessimistic than the room, right? I would say, here are a bunch of slides showing all of our revenue and engagement going up and to the right, but we have some other problems here that I'm really concerned about, and and I'm generally, and I'm not delighted with where we are. And then the board would say, members of the board would say, "Oh, well, wait a second, look at this and look at that. You're like, this is amazing, you know." And so, and likewise with the team, it was better to basically, people have just to see, nothing's more motivating than just watching a business succeed, like doing good work, being honest about the problems, and watching everyone seeing it work. And so I used to try too hard to sort of, charge everyone's battery with enthusiasm. And I learned as a more seasoned leader that was not my job, actually.
Yeah, that's very cool. Kind of a transparent way of doing it, and then execution is what matters, right? Like the people who are doing it is what matters. So that kind of is a piggyback to our finale question. Knowing what you know now, what would you tell Rufus 10 years ago?
10 years ago, I wouldn't have too much to say to myself. That was post sale of the business. But 20 years ago, if you'll allow me to go back 20 years, I would have said, like, when a business fails, it's liberating. When a business succeeds, it's liberating. When a business is sort of stuck in between failure and success in a kind of middling zone, that can be imprisoning. And my first business got kind of stuck in that zone for a decade. And, I probably should have found ways to wind it down or fundamentally change the business. And so I think, just being sober-minded about opportunity costs, being incredibly intentional about, relationships. And I would also say, as you said earlier, like the early businesses that quote unquote failed, I had a conversation with Seth Godin, the great kind of marketing guru, who was like, "Rufus, you don't use that word. Don't use the word failed, because you can build a business that might not be financially successful, but if you build great relationships, you do something wonderful for your customer base, for your team, and you're learning, and there's a lot of joy that's coming out of it. That's a win, and the financial outcome is one of many indications of success, and it's a long journey,
Yeah, well said. So what are you working on now? I know it's Next Big Idea Club, but what can you tell us about it and where people can learn about it?
Yeah, thank you. So the Next Big Idea Club is we work with these 4 extraordinary curators: Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, Daniel Pink. We select the most game-changing new books. We distill them every day. We have a new book that we deliver by email, and we have a daily podcast and a weekly podcast, distilled down to 10 to 15 minutes of audio by the authors themselves. Different from Blinkist, which, this is like the authors themselves. And I host a weekly podcast called The Next Big Idea. And we're just having a blast. And we also have a book subscription product. So it's like the most important new books. The world's changing really fast. We need to understand how it's changing. We're all about, delivering the most important new ideas to navigate the changing world.
Right on. And where can people learn about it?
Just search for Next Big Idea, and we'll come right up, either on your podcast player or on the web more broadly.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing that beautiful story. I really enjoyed it. I think everybody listening enjoyed it, and a lot of good knowledge in there for sure.
My pleasure. Thank you, Steve. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And wherever you guys are listening on iTunes or Spotify, the links that Rufus mentioned will be in the show notes. And thanks again.